And we'll turn it over to Shaun, who is chairing the session.
Well, thank you, Sally, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for coming for the second panel of today, entitled Social Pressures in Main Street and Babbitt. My name is Shaun F. Richards, and I'll be moderating the session as well as presenting. I'd like to start off by thanking the officers of the Sinclair Lewis Society, especially Sally, for organizing this conference, to Ed Sell, Centron Gonzalez for helping with the tech. So we have 3 talks in this panel again, and then we'll do questions. You can either type them in the chat and then we'll ask them, or you can the reactions button down there. You could raise your hand, and if all else fails, just shout out. But we'll unmute people at the end to ask questions. So I'll introduce our panelists as they appear in the program. First, we have Richard Bellon. Richard is a historian of science at Michigan State University, whose research specializes in Victorian British science. His teaching ranges widely over questions of science and culture, including classes anchored by Sinclair Lewis's Aerosmith and Huxley's Brave New World. His publications include A Sincere and Teachable Heart, Self-Denying Virtue in British Intellectual Life from 1736 to 1859, and Inspiration in the Harness of Daily Labor, Darwin, Botany, and the Triumph of Evolution, 1859 through 1868, which won the Price Webster Prize from the History of Science Society. So congratulations, Richard. His talk is entitled Brave New Main Street and makes some transatlantic comparisons between Lewis and Huxley. And then we have Greg Davis. Greg is a Toledo native. He graduated in 1996 from Haverford College and later from the Citadel, where he received an MAT in 2002. For the last 20 years, Greg has taught high school and middle school English in South Carolina and Ohio. While prepping for an American literature course in 2007, Greg stumbled across Babbitt and fell in love with the writings of Sinclair Lewis from Chapter 1. Greg's talk is titled Exploring Zenith, Narrative Technique in Babbitt, and will contrast Lewis's development of character and setting from small-town Main Street to the more complex city of Zenith. And last but least is me, Shaun F. Richards. I received my PhD in American Studies from the College of William and Mary this January, and I'm on the job market. That's my new slogan at these conferences this summer. So my research examines U.S. literature and culture during the long 19th century through critical theories of race, gender, sexuality, and class. My dissertation, Disembodied Professionalisms, Doctors and Scientists in U.S. Literature, argues that modern professionalism through the power dynamics of what Foucault calls the clinical gaze, reinforces elite white masculinity's traditional association with reason and authority. And I also had a chapter on Aerosmith in there. So Richard and I have a lot to talk about. It looks like I'm leading off, so without further ado, here goes. Our ideal citizen, Boosterism as Pride and Prejudice in Sinclair Lewis's Babbitt. This talk is about an exceptionally American phenomenon, Boosterism, whereby a place's residents work to improve public opinion about themselves, their local businesses, social organizations, churches, and politics, and to promote these institutions over similar ones from elsewhere. Boosters define themselves through their association with place, a supposedly unique set of local traditions and personality traits, as well as through their differences from people from other places. They instinctively augment aspects of themselves while mocking outsiders' physical appearances, foreign customs, political, economic, and spiritual beliefs as being radically different from and even capable of undermining those of most Americans.
Shaun, your sound somehow, I'm getting, are the rest of you sort of hearing this intermittently or in a blurred way? I don't know.
I can't hear it.
Closer to the mic.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
It's true. I mean, it's, I don't know whether sometimes when you're leaning down, your voice becomes a little bit muffled or something. Edsel, do you have any suggestions?
Do you by any chance have maybe some headphones with a microphone that
I
could help?
don't. I don't.
Well, right now you're sounding more clear. Can you try
Maybe
speaking?
maybe it's because of the way I'm trying to look at my papers here. So I'll try and project a little louder. Do I sound better now? I'm seeing some head shakes. No.
Only moderately.
That's perfect.
All right, I'll try not to move my head.
Okay, that would be.
Okay, so boosting and its antithesis, which is knocking or pettily criticizing someone or thing, produce a dialectic, a pluralized me and a not me of them. In less jargony terms, you are where you're from, we are from here, they are not, here is good, there is bad, we're good, they're not. Boosting thus forges a local social identity that greatly overlaps with the national one and also uses place and difference to define and to police ever-changing and always tense boundaries of who's American and who isn't. No other US character as perfectly embodies this self-promotional antagonism as the eponymous protagonist of Lewis's 1922 novel. George F. Babbitt envisions the ideal American citizen as a resident of a growing nondescript Midwestern city. He undoubtedly feels some, quote, genius authentic love for his city and clan. His every other word either touts Zenith's potential by citing its booming population and bloated economy, or knocks a non-Zenithite. Whether he's talking to his typical family, fellow roughnecks, or brother workers with both white and blue collars, Babbitt boosts himself by bullying others. Never mind that his opinions about Zenith and American superiority are mass manufactured and force-fed to Americans, who then regurgitate these easily digestible facts about themselves to one another. While many of Babbitt's interactions with others often turn argumentative, nowhere is his speech as divisive than during his short-lived side gig as a public speaker. And this is in chapter 14, if anyone has their text in here then. During these speeches, Babbitt employs the us versus them rhetoric of Boosterism. His words reveal how Boosterism's competitive ethos and combative rhetoric reinforces prejudice against non-ideal or un-American Americans. Although his rhetoric deals with identity and inequality in America during the historical moment of 1922, nevertheless, these issues continue to divide our country domestically between red and blue states and isolate us globally. Paradoxically then, boosting has made the US into a global superpower as well as an international laughingstock. Reconsidering Babbitt's speech in terms of the recent rise of white nationalism and populism, as well as a growing cultural desensitization to inflammatory rhetoric and even hate speech directed towards racial and ethnic minorities, political adversaries, and non-Christians, shows how Boosterism as an expression of both pride and prejudice is not a recent development, but rather a national trait of, quote, this enduring type of ours. And whenever I do quotes, I'll be pulling from these speeches. So in the long speech, Babbitt proclaims himself a quote, representative businessman to boost ideals of individual freedom, hard work, and conservative morality. Values all deeply rooted in the nation's agrarian, Republican, and Puritan history. The breadwinning husband booms about the virtues of honesty, industry, thrift, and public spiritedness, as first outlined by founding father Ben Franklin. But Babbitt also engages in illegal backroom deals and attends bland suburban bacchanalias. These hypocrisies poke holes in his puffed up self-perception and as Zenith's mouthpiece of the citizens' collective narcissism. His pathetic misadventures in suburbia distract from some of the more troubling things Babbitt says, including statements that outright promote white nationalism, consumer capitalism, political corporatism, religious charlatanism, and American exceptionalism. Babbitt's ideal citizen exudes pride in the communities to which he imagines belonging. This solid, sane, and standardized person is a decent white middle-class, middle American family man, a God-fearing Christian, a registered Republican, a canny yet, quote, conventionally honest businessman, an outspoken booster, and lastly, a loyal elk, or a libertarian, Kiwanian, red man, or Knight of Columbus. Babbitt favorably compares Zenith to other similar-sized U.S. cities and contrasts it and hence all of American cities with those in the quote, worn out and decayed countries of Europe. He brags that Zenith ranks fourth in the number of quote, decent white men who make between quote 4,000 to 10,000 a year and practice the only quote sane politics and religion, which are Christian and Republican. And Zenith is ranked here in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia.
Shaun,
Yeah.
The sound is out again a little bit. Try another, maybe move the
Another
head.
angle here.
Yeah, other angle. Yeah.
Sorry about this, guys.
Not moving your head seemed to be working well for a minute.
I'm trying to think what to do if
It's good right now.
is that okay?
Yes. So
All right. Okay, so we talked about the worn out and decayed countries of Europe, decent white men, sane. Okay. Unlike the old world, which produces only shabby bums living in attics and feeding on booze and spaghetti, modern Zenith makes more condensed milk, evaporated cream, cardboard boxes, and light fixtures in the US and ranks no lower than sixth in other similarly unappealing products like leather findings, and I don't know what those are, and breakfast food with no additional description there. They also have the second tallest business building in all US inland cities. And then there's all the bathrooms, these sort of symbols of American, the apex of civilization. The thriving business district thrusts vertically toward the heavens, and its exurban housing tracts sprawl outward. Together, these structures express Zenith's, quote, public spirit and forward-looking idealism in architectural terms. Babbitt's profession as a realtor is built upon selling the American dream home, somewhere between a pastoral landscape and a metropolitan cityscape, combining the security and comfort of a nice home, conservative values, sound business, and some capital C culture. This is the America. However, this modern Elysium elides any mention of the cramped urban spaces where isolated groups of immigrants cohabit in slums indiscriminately, quote, without fellowship, local tradition, or public spirit. In his speech, Babbitt name checks numerous racial, ethnic, and national types, as well as members of other religious faiths, political parties, and socioeconomic classes, all of whom he sees as threatening his vision, which is America's vision. He others city dwellers for looking differently, speaking foreign languages, following alien traditions, and lacking any familiar or social bond with their immediate neighbors or the local geography. According to him, America is under siege from these undesirable hordes of working class minorities, radical socialist and communist agitators, and of the long-haired intellectuals that have infiltrated state universities. No matter that many of these othered Americans were barred from reaching the American dream precisely because of their skin color, nationality, social class, faith, or political affiliation. So the most efficient way to boost one's local identity, it seems, is to knock outsiders and theirs. Simply naming those who unsuccessfully assimilate as either foreigners, invaders, or agitators is enough to condemn these unfortunates to life sentences in Zenith's netherworld, a much longer stretch than Babbitt's brief purgatory after momentarily, quote, turning crank himself. Babbitt's speech, however, quote, gently whispers the quiet parts out loud, listing several of hot button issues expressed today by the so-called silent majority and the white grievance politics on today's cable news broadcast. This is McCarthyism before McCarthyism. It can't happen here, happening here. But most concerning is Babbitt threatening anyone unwilling to, quote, get out and root for Uncle Samuel USA, and, quote, the all-around unlimited greatness of Zenith with fists and, quote, square-toed boots from he-men like him for being traitorous knockers. Eventually, Babbitt grows bored with his comfortable but humdrum life. While not explicitly knocking Zenith, Babbitt does begin to question its inhabitants' self-anointed authority, including his own, not long after making these speeches. Once outed as a, quote, parlor socialist, though, Babbitt's open invitations to speak are rescinded. He loses a lucrative real estate deal. He gets reminded of all the boosts he's received and nearly loses everything for which he's striven. Only the proverbial cold water splashed on him by wife Myra's appendicitis sobers up our, quote, domestic revolutionist from his radical bender. This experience leads Babbitt to stop taking Myra and the comfortable, if passionless domesticity she represents for granted, as well as the, quote, hearthstone, the basic foundation of American civilization. Babbitt's remarks at an annual convention of local realtors are fully transcribed by a local Booster-owned newspaper. And this is some of the formatting that George was speaking about. However, his talking points seem out of place considering the professional setting. He depicts Zenith as a place of socio-political harmony while simultaneously knocking larger cities for being centers of diversity and vice. Though Babbitt's sentiments here are more stentorian than other, less formal comments he makes in the novel, his message stays essentially the same regardless of whom he's addressing. It's not relevant that what he says to this appreciative Congress of like-minded individuals would be more appropriate at a political rally. What matters is that this message articulates the ultimate Booster ethos of homogeneity by debasing people of color, immigrants, blue-collar workers, professors, communists out of one side of his mouth while boosting white, native-born, white-collar professionals like himself as the only real American. Babbitt, I'm going to skip this part, but it's really fascinating. American boosters gave lip service to the country's moral tradition while envisioning a future of progress devoid of the social ills that plague other places. At the heart of Boosterism, then, is racism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, anti-unionism, anti-intellectualism, political cronyism, and unfettered capitalism. These ugly isms are at the heart of the standard American. And while Seneca Doane, the radical lawyer, defends American standardization because its booming commodity-based consumer culture actually frees up time for Americans like him to express their individuality, Lewis staunchly opposed modern standardization, especially in individual thought and speech. So one tenet of this provincialist cosmopolitanism that is Boosterism, then, is an endless accumulation of household goods, the easy accessibility of which places Zenith at the American metropole. The home appliances, the cigar lighters, the closed-top sedans that are ever present in every home show that civilization can be bought and sold. Despite this progressive vision, however, Boosterism never threatened real Americans or their values of individual rights and property, free market capitalism, and the privilege of local elites. Boosterism does, however, open an us-them divide that associates American identity with place, so much so that newcomers remain strangers until they either fully embrace the second half of their hyphenated Americanness at the expense of their former through assimilating, or if they remain un-Americanized outsiders, or if they became so disillusioned with this American vision, Then they were branded as enemies of the state. In the novel, these are the Irish American pro-union workers who ought to be lynched, the Black Americans who should stay in their places, the Bolsheviks in Russia who should be subjected to a regime change, the mollycoddles with no pep, zip, or vision, the Swedish bartenders, the Italian waiters, the Black porters, the other poor zobs without the vim and vigor to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, moderate their boozing, and produce. It is as if the variety of other Americans against which Babbitt and his ilk define themselves belong to a separate melting pot, one from which only the cream rising to the top is spooned over into the crock labeled American. I had a conclusion that talked about implications of not just about race, but about gender and class struggle and things like that, that I think could be parsed from these speeches. But I'll, in the interest of time and the fact that I'm not sure if anybody can hear me, I'll just leave it there. So I appreciate everybody for sticking with me. Richard is next.
Really enjoyed that. What I'm going to be doing in my talk is, at least in terms of format, is a little bit different. When kind of COVID hit and everything is forced online, originally I would just kind of record lectures, which was narrating over slideshows, and I became dissatisfied with that. And so instead I started recording my kind of presentations to my students as sort of podcasts. And I brought my wife in to create a conversational conversation around the day's topic. So I think this has worked very well in teaching. What I'm going to do is I'm going, with your, if you'll excuse the indulgence, is try that with you guys as well. So I pre-recorded a podcast style presentation with my wife. And so I'm going to play that instead of reading the paper, and we'll hope that this goes. Hopefully that this will go off well. Starting with, of course, the audio successfully playing. Hello, everyone. For the next 15 minutes or so, I'm just going to pause. Did everybody? Was that okay? Good. All right. Let's go. I'm going to explore a really fascinating literary relationship between the works of Sinclair Lewis and Aldous Huxley, particularly Huxley's novel Brave New World. Joining me for this conversation, kind of podcast style, is my wife, Vicki.
Hello, Rich.
Hey, Vicki. Welcome aboard.
So, hi, everyone. We don't have a lot of time here, do we? So let's jump right in. Tell me, Rich, what's interesting about placing Lewis and Huxley side by side?
Well, I think one of the things that this does, it allows us to get a richer picture of the cultural, political, social, scientific, technological developments that shaped life in the early 20th century. And it was these really quite profound transformations that both Lewis and Huxley react to in their fiction and also in their nonfiction. And so as a historian of science, I'm particularly kind of interested in these sort of questions about how science not just changes society, but how people understand these changes and what they see as their consequences. And I think there are probably, you really see this in the work of Huxley and of Sinclair Lewis.
Interesting. But I thought the settings of Lewis's novels in the 20s, they don't have that much in common, do they, with these futuristic worlds of Huxley's, particularly the futuristic world of Brave New World?
Yeah, it doesn't, at least superficially. I mean, if you look at Gopher Prairie or even Zenith, they don't seem to have a lot in common with the sleek and sterile London of kind of Huxley's future dystopia. Lewis's novels are rooted very much into the first decades of the 20th century, and Huxley is extrapolating 600 years in the future. But if you focus just on the setting, I think it's misleading. I would say, this actually not really in jest, but quite seriously. I think we can read Brave New World as a sequel to Lewis's novels of the 1920s. That somewhere, I can imagine, subsumed in the world state of Brave New World is the city of Zenith. It still exists, and maybe even somebody might remember the name of a defunct administrative unit called Winnemac. So I think, to put it more directly, Brave New World is the dystopian endpoint of the social, technological, and cultural trends that Lewis kind of explores in Main Street, Babbitt, Aerosmith, Elmer Gantry, Dodsworth.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about Brave New World.
Well, the novel was published in 1932, so it's a few years after Dodsworth and a year before Lewis publishes Anne Vickers. So also just a couple of just shortly on after Lewis wins the Nobel Prize in Literature. And to understand though what Brave New World is trying to accomplish, I'm going to turn to sort of Huxley himself. In 1956, there's a radio adaptation of the novel, and so he serves as narrator. So we're going to listen to Aldous Huxley's own voice to talk about Brave New World.
Brave New World is a fantastic parable about the dehumanization of human beings. In the next utopia described in my story, man has been subordinated to his own inventions. Science, technology, social organization. These things have ceased to serve man. They have become his masters. Brave World is the study of the future as it may be unless we are extremely careful. It depicts a society in which man has replaced nature by science, morality by drugs, individuality by total conformity. It is a hideous prospect, yet we seem determined to follow this path of self-destruction. But Brave New World need not be our future. The choice, after all, is always in our own hands.
So some themes jump out from this very posh voice.
Yes, very posh.
Yeah, dehumanization, human subordination to science, subordination to technology, total conformity. So where do these concerns come from?
Well, for Huxley, we can see that Brave New World allows him to deal with a whole range of preoccupations that he develops in the 1920s. These sort of coalesce in the novel. And I think the first is his concern about the role of science in society, and not just the role of the type of pure science, but also, most significantly, applied science. Science as not science as knowledge, but science as power.
But Huxley came from a scientific family.
And his grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, was one of Darwin's great defenders in the 19th century. Aldous's older brother, Julian, was one of the most important biologists in the first half of the 20th century. And so Aldous understood the world of modern science very well, not just intellectually, but also he was plugged in sort of socially. The novel famously starts at the central London hatchery and conditioning center. This is where human beings are manufactured. They're gestated in jars, carefully engineered to their future occupational and social roles. Now, this idea, ectogenesis is called, wasn't something that Huxley invented. It was popularized about a decade earlier in a book called Daedalus, or Science in the Future. Now, for most people, the author of this book was a biologist named J.P.S. Haldane. But to Aldous, the author was Jack Haldane, a good friend. They knew each other as undergrad. They would routinely get drunk and sing filthy songs. So, this issue of ectogenesis is not just something that he is kind of reading about, is something that he's discussing with the scientists whose work is making this type of technology plausible, of possible. So this is really kind of central to what Huxley is doing in Brave New World. He's really at the kind of if not a practicing scientist himself, he knows the leading scientists that, you know, from his family connections, from his brother.
And H.G. Wells was another acquaintance.
Oh yes, very much so. And in fact, Julian Huxley, Aldous' older brother, made a great deal of money co-writing the three-volume The Science of Life with Wells and Wells' son Gip. And it was Wells that really provides one of the important impetus for Brave New World, because Huxley, as he kind of recounts, as he recoils from Wells's utopian view of this technologically engineered future. And it was an ideal that for decades throughout the 20th century, Wells is pushing this idea that humanity can turn the corner on all of the suffering and inequity and misery if we can have a age of cultural brilliance and social harmony, but only if we have the good sense to turn our fate over to technocracy. And so Brave New World is Huxley's rejoinder. He basically says a world run on engineering principles would not elevate culture, it would flatten it into the uniformity of the lowest common denominator. And so the principles of Wells' utopia realized, Huxley said, wouldn't result in brilliant individuals, but complacent, brain-dead cogs.
Now, Aldous Huxley didn't just have important connections on his father's side, there were some pretty important connections on his mother's side too, weren't there? He was not just a Huxley, but he was an Arnold as well.
Yeah, he was. So his mother, Maria Arnold Huxley, kind of taps him into a illustrious family. I mean, Aldous' great-grandfather was the Reverend Thomas Arnold of rugby fame, the great historian, a great religious controversialist. His great-uncle, Matthew Arnold, his godmother and aunt was Julia Ward, who was a highly successful novelist. And so what's interesting is that Thomas and Matthew and Julia were not just prominent literary and intellectual figures. Each wrote movingly and influentially about the place of faith in a rapidly changing society. And so this place of culture, and how does culture and religion and faith exist in this new world being created originally in industrializing Britain. This was what the Arnolds grappled with, and it was part of Aldous' inheritance, as much part of his inheritance as kind of the scientific side that he gets from the Huxleys. And so Brave New World is really as much a novel of religion as it is of science. And so, Matthew Arnold famously in his poem Dover Beach explores what happens when the sea of faith withdraws. In Brave New World, Huxley answers his great uncle's question.
Because Brave New World depicts a godless society.
It does, but it's not one without religion. So this is a really important feature of Brave New World, is that at the heart of it is Fordism, is Henry Ford. The novel takes place, and Huxley dates it quite precisely to the year 632 AF, after Ford. So everything in the world state and this dystopia kind of dates its principles. It sees its inception from Ford's creation of the assembly line in the earliest 20th century. And to see the role of Ford and Fordism, I'm going to play another short clip from the 1956 radio play.
Notice the games, all carefully constructed to use as many mechanical devices as possible. In olden times, children used to play simple games using only a ball and a bat. Oh, madness. Nothing was added to increase consumption. Then came our Ford. He taught us the principle of mass production in the assembly line many centuries ago and changed all that. Ford's in his liver. All's well with the world.
So why Ford and his motor company?
Well, two reasons. One is that Ford, like Wells, was one of the really kind of instigating factors in for Brave New World. As Huxley himself tells the story, he's traveling to the United States in 1927, so his first visit to America. And so on the trip over, he comes across Henry Ford's memoir. And so Huxley reads it as he's both fascinated and appalled. And the memoir is fascinating. It's not just it's not dull. It's not just Ford saying, look at me, I'm a rich guy, let's celebrate me. Ford has a vision. And it's a vision that is grounded in the assembly line, not just a question of industrial technique, but a question ultimately of social organization. And so Ford says what you can see that we're doing, in Michigan, that this is going to change the whole world. We're just a little bit down that road. And Huxley kind of reads this and he's already concerned about the overweening power of technology and engineering life. And so this really, for that read Ford's memoirs and Ford sort of he sees a very sinister prediction that the assembly line is going to encompass all. Huxley kind of takes that and he embeds that in sort of Brave New World. So he had these ideas before reading Ford, but Ford gives him this organizing principle to understand these fears he has about social organization and ultimately about culture. Huxley is deeply concerned about the mass production of culture. And so, so this kind of helps him organize the novel. But Ford is also a really good foil in the novel itself. I mean, Ford, was one of the most famous men in the world. The closest maybe we can think of today is Elon Musk, although I would say probably Ford maybe was even more prominent a century ago than Musk is today. And like Musk, Ford is just encrusted with cultural meaning. So Huxley can rely on that meaning as kind of powerful shorthand, which, for example, he has the subjects of the world state make the sign of the T on their stomachs.
So the sign of the Model T on their place of consumption.
On their place of consumption, right. It's absolutely wonderful satire, right? And it's something that, again, he so much gets captured in that his readers are going to pick up immediately. And so that it really works well with the context of the novel.
So let's turn back to Lewis. What ties Brave New World to Lewis's novels of the 20s?
Well, one of the things is that, again, I would sort of emphasize that Huxley prophesies a dystopian future, which extrapolates almost perfectly from the world that Lewis creates in his novels. And, most obviously and important is this shared profoundly deep concern with cultural conformity, particularly under sort of the pressure of mass consumerism. I mean, with this audience, I don't have to go into a great kind of deal of detail on this point. I think most people will appreciate this. But, there's a few points that I would sort of highlight. I mean, again, the automobiles play a really important role in Lewis's depiction of standardized culture. I mean, when he noted that main streets from Buffalo to San Diego were converging on this bland shared identity, it's a rows of Model Ts that would be lining all of these streets, which would symbolize this growing interchangeability of not just economic life, but cultural life. And then, of course, for anybody who's read Dodsworth, Sam Dodsworth, the businessman hero of the novel, at the start is he's pressured into selling his beloved Revelation Motor Company.
Revelation, clear religious implications there.
Yeah, very, very clear sort of religious implication. There's something of, if not, supernatural religion, there's certain this idea of something with greater meaning and So who does Dosworth sell the company to? A company which Lewis emphasizes was kind of founded on craftsmanship and innovation. Well, he's kind of forced to sell it to the Unit Automotive Company. Even that name just indicates this is an enterprise which triumphs in the market through aggressive standardization. And so you see that. I mean, the society of Brave New World and the way in which it's riddled with small-minded gossip and petty jockeying for social position, it really recalls, I think, particularly to the Babbitt. Particular way that the gossip and the jockeying all are in service to conformity. I mean, really, it's Brave New World tells the story of the good citizens league of Zenith endowed with totalitarian power. You can look at, like the Feelies and these other insipid entertainment of the world state. You can see this as a logical extension of things like the poetry of Shaun F from Babbitt.
I know that we're running out of time here, but did Huxley and Lewis know each other?
No, they certainly knew of each other. But my troll through kind of the secondary and print primary sources, I haven't found any evidence that they ever met face to face. Although, I mean, again, it would be simply impossible that they wouldn't have known each other. And in fact, like Huxley makes a handful of references to Lewis in his essays. For example, in 1929, in the essay for Vanity Fair, he uses sort of Babbitt and Zenith as a shorthand for standardization. And he does this with a clear expectation that his readers will get the reference.
They have any friends in common?
They did. They did. That's why it's a little odd they never met. Edith Wharton and H.L. Mencken are two prominent examples. They were both tied personally, not just intellectually, to H.G. Wells, although, the relationships there were a little bit more trouble between Huxley and Wells, to put it mildly. So it was a little peculiar that, again, as far as I can tell, they never met.
But what do we gain by comparing Lewis and Huxley?
What it does is it deepens our appreciation of how these two influential and brilliant and important writers grappled with the challenges of modernity in the opening decades of the 20th century. Other things that we can see, if we had more time, I could talk for probably hours on how Aerosmith and I subject you to that. How Aerosmith and Brave New World address the place of science in the modern world. And the prayer of the scientist from Aerosmith could have come directly from the mouth of Aldous Huxley's grandfather, Thomas Huxley. And the novels, I think, are particularly good in highlighting kind of the differences, the different types of science. Science is not just one single unified thing. There is a profound difference that Lewis would say, and Huxley would agree, between applied science and pure science. And finally, this conference is dedicated to exploring Sinclair Lewis's life and work. Lewis's influence, directly or indirectly, Lewis influenced Brave New World. How directly, I think, is an open question, but the influence is there. And so Lewis's kind of ideas kind of filtering through into one of the most enduring novels of the 20th century shows that there's so much more to say and so much more to learn about the legacy of Sinclair Lewis, as most important and remarkable of novelists.
Okay, thanks, Rich.
All right, thank you very much, Vicki.
All right, everyone. That's my sort of presentation. So I will kick it back to Shaun.
All right, can everybody hear me? I'm seeing Carol's screen for some reason. Oh, there we go. So next, thank you for that. That was interesting, especially with we talking about plays, filmed plays and things like that yesterday. So the experiment with form, very cool. Okay, next we have Greg Davis, and he's talking, his talk is entitled Exploring Zenith, Narrative Technique in Babbitt. And take it away, Greg.
Thank you, Shaun. First, I want to say thank you to you, Shaun, for your guidance and your support, and Sally for all of the feedback and guidance you've given me. Also, I believe I saw Rusty already on here, and thank you all, Rusty, for having read and supported and given me guidance in preparing this paper. I'll just jump in. So my title again is Exploring Zenith Narrative Technique in Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis. Lewis scholars Richard Lingaman and James Hutchinson have comprehensively described Lewis's work as a writer in planning his novels, gathering dope from real people and settings that he could then use to generate fiction, creating enormous maps, taking notes, trying out characters, and exhaustively revising drafts until he achieved perfection. Lewis's strategies for research and preparation had been developed in the 1910s, if not before, and it seems that they were largely unchanged from Main Street to Babbitt. But if Lewis's research strategies remained consistent in this period, I would argue that he intentionally shifted narrative techniques in order to achieve the goals that he set out for himself as a writer. This paper will briefly examine Lewis's narrative technique in Main Street in order to contrast it with the approach he used to explore the much more complex metropolitan world of Zenith and Babbitt. The setting of Gopher Prairie is characterized by its awful simplicity, and Lewis uses simple description to capture its essence. When first approaching her new home by train, the protagonist Carol Kennicott is shocked to see that, quote, Gopher Prairie was merely an enlargement of all the hamlets which they had been passing through. The field swept up to it, past it. Even the biggest thoroughfare, Main Street, is shabby and unimpressive. The streets were cluttered with electric light poles, telephone poles, gasoline pumps for motor cars. This is a super ultra close-up of the street. As one who has dreamed about making architectural improvements, Carol is appalled by what she finds. The village, unplanned, field engulfed and cluttered, seems claustrophobically small from the start. As a place, Gopher Prairie is small and simple to a fault, but quite easy to describe. The city of Zenith, by contrast, is huge and complex, and to capture it, Lewis needs to begin by zooming out. After Lewis begins with the description of the towers of Zenith, which were neither citadels nor churches, but frankly and beautifully office buildings, he sketches out the urban landscape from which these towers rose. I want to just share my screen for just a second. I know that this is a quote that we've referenced a few times today about the towers of Zenith. And this is actually a postcard from the early 20th century of Cincinnati, as you can see from Mount Adams, which may have actually been a model for Floral Heights in a sense, because this really feels very much like the description that he's going to go on and give of Zenith. So again, he describes the towers of Zenith, which were neither churches nor citadels, but frankly and beautifully, neither citadels nor churches, but frankly and beautifully office buildings. And then he goes on to write, the mist took pity on the fretted structures of earlier generations, the post office with shingle tortured mansards, the red brick minarets of hulking old houses, factories with stingy and sooted windows, wood tenements colored like mud. The city was full of such grotesqueries, but the clean towers were thrusting from the business center, and on the farther hills were the shiny new houses for laughter and tranquility, which again feels like the perspective of this actual view of Cincinnati or Zenith, which was in part based on the city of Cincinnati. The architectural triumph of the skyscraper here is planted among the mud-colored tenements and pitiful grotesqueries of the past, using plurals such as towers of Zenith, hulking old houses, factories, and wood tenements. Lewis is able to sketch out districts within a complex and changing city landscape. The juxtaposition of the fretted structures of earlier generations and the shiny new houses in the hills allows Lewis to introduce tensions of class and social rank that exist within the city. Zenith is not a small unified village built to smother differences like Gopher Prairie. It is a complex and growing city, one that houses within it separate universes with their own histories and cultures. I'm going to stop share here. Just as Lewis juxtaposes buildings or districts side by side in space, he uses another technique to overlap events in simultaneous time. In a unique passage that happens after Babbitt falls asleep in his suburban home, somebody earlier mentioned the milk truck waking him up. So he's kind of hilarious, like on his sleeping porch. So he finally falls asleep. In a unique passage that happens after he falls asleep, Lewis sketches out 12 vignettes of life around Zenith, beginning with the same phrase, "at that moment." The comically restless Babbitt finally slips into a blessed state of oblivion, and at that moment in the city of Zenith, Horace Updike was making love to Lucille McKelvey in her mauve dining room. Then without transition, we learned that at that moment in Zenith, a cocaine runner and a prostitute were drinking cocktails in Healy Hanson's saloon. You may recall that that's the prostitute who gets shot casually. Lewis goes on, at that moment in Zenith, two men sat in a laboratory working on a report of their investigations of synthetic rubber. At that moment in Zenith, there was a conference of 4 union officials as to whether the 12,000 coal miners within 100 miles of the city should strike. Lewis visits a dozen such scenes, descending from Babbitt's Floral Heights home into and through various spaces in the city in the fashion of a Dickensian ghost. While some characters from these scenes appear later in the novel, the kaleidoscopic passage here does little to advance the novel's storyline. Instead, I would argue that it serves as part of Lewis's introduction of Zenith and reflects one of his goals for Babbitt, which scholar James Hutchinson gleaned from Lewis's working notes on the novel. Hutchinson writes, Lewis wanted to give a, quote, picture of and do justice to all of the city as a cosmos. And that was in Lewis's notes for his intentions for Babbitt. Lewis's panoramic cityscape and the collage of overlapping scenes help to introduce Zenith, but neither technique is capable of pulling the reader into and through the novel's urban landscape. To explore this imagined cosmos fully, Lewis needed a character whose dispositions would cause him to wander through the city's various worlds, from inner circle to outer periphery and back again. And here again, I feel that connection with Virgil, with Dante's Inferno, and how he's going to move through and kind of introduce this entire cosmos. Babbitt's character, with its unique blend of traits, answered this need. I'd like to return for a moment to the character of Carol Kennicott, whose simplicity provides an interesting contrast with Babbitt. From her days at Blodgett College, Carol had dreamed of being a crusader against small-mindedness, but when she moves to Gopher Prairie, her ideas are rejected. Faced with ridicule and suspicion, Carol's idealism sours, and over the course of the novel, she shifts from being a quixotic college student to being a humbled reformer. But her character is steady enough to leave intact the tension between a protagonist trying to introduce new ideas and a small town bent on refusing them. The character of George F. Babbitt is far more complex, dynamic, and unstable. Certain aspects of Babbitt's character have kept him anchored in his suburban home and have made him socially successful in Zenith in the first part of the novel. Babbitt's shallowness has always made it easy for him to find peace. He's mesmerized by new products. His mind is occupied by small things, and for the most part, he lives in an ecstasy of self-appreciation, as Lewis describes. As a businessman, Babbitt can be cunning and ruthless. His ambition and his affability contribute to his ascent in Zenith society, and these characteristics at the beginning of the novel make Babbitt a comfortable insider. When other traits come to the fore, though, he is led away from the inner circles of Zenith. From his first introduction, Babbitt's character is marked by a restlessness contained just beneath the surface. We learned that Babbitt is, quote, extremely married and unromantic, but in the next sentence, he is fantasizing about a rendezvous with a young woman again. I'm going to cut across the grain of Robert McLaughlin's idea of this being platonic. I feel that he is really dreaming about this girl, you know, in a sexual way. I'm sorry to say, you know, sounds kind of gross, but this is Babbitt. Anyways, so apologies, Robert McLaughlin. So we learned that Babbitt is extremely married, but here again, he's dreaming about this rendezvous. Later in the book, of course, Babbitt attends a conference in the city of Monarch and goes on a late night adventure with increasingly drunk and obnoxious peers. Babbitt's wayward desires in this episode allow Lewis to describe the fictional world he had so thoroughly imagined, even beyond the city of Zenith. So this is when he's on that adventure. Lewis writes, as they drove back through the outskirts of Monarch, down streets of small brown wooden cottages of workmen, as they rattled across warehouse districts, which by drunken night seemed vast and perilous, as they were borne toward the red lights and the stocky women who simpered, Babbitt was frightened. The night ends for Babbitt with, quote, musty, unsatisfying experiments, such as he had not known since college, but his sexual appetite is by no means exhausted. Babbitt's wayward desires persist, and he wades into an affair with Miss Tanis Judique, which deepens to such an extent that he begins to lead what is essentially a double life. Swept away by this relationship, he breaks away from Zenith's stage master class and into the rowdy young company of the Bunch. Thus, Babbitt's errant sexual desires energize plot lines in the story and allow Lewis to explore the city of Zenith and its environs both geographically and sociologically. Another aspect of Babbitt's character, his impressionability, allows Lewis to explore different ways of being and thinking in the city of Zenith. Babbitt's impressionability can be detected early on following his meeting with banker William Washington Eathorne, after which Babbitt decides that he needs to be more Eathorne-like. Slang, colloquial, cut it out, he tells himself. Had too much of this hoop-de-doodle and good fella stuff. This resolution has little impact on the overall storyline, but later Babbitt's impressionability leads to a critical shift in his outlook following a chance encounter on a train with lawyer Seneca Doane. Doane reminds Babbitt about the young man he'd been when they were first acquainted. In college, you're an unusually liberal, sensitive chap, Doane says. I still recall your saying to me that you're going to be a lawyer and take the cases of the poor for nothing. Babbitt's shift to Doane's way of thinking is breathtakingly fast. Trouble with a lot of these fellows, George F. Babbitt says, is that they aren't broad-minded and liberal. That's a surprising statement from George F. Babbitt. Though brief, the conversation with Doane is deeply inspiring and to Babbitt, and afterward he felt, quote, daring and idealistic and cosmopolitan. Babbitt's trait of impressionability allows for dramatic transformation here that leads to significant plot shifts. One other moment that comes to mind, if I can just insert briefly, it was mentioned earlier that after eating a questionable clam, Babbitt finds himself questioning his religious philosophy. It doesn't take much to bring about in Babbitt's mindset like some big shifts, and I feel like the idea of the episodic nature of the story is facilitated by this quality of Babbitt to kind of shift radically from one thing to another. It's kind of built into his character. While Babbitt's errant desires and his impressionability act as centrifugal forces pushing him away from his initial environment and mindset, his need to belong acts as an important centripetal force in the novel. This is especially critical when Babbitt finds himself at odds with his peers from the athletic club as a result of this slide to the left, inspired by Seneca Doane. After the conservative Professor Pumphrey spots Babbitt at the wheel of a car full of drunken revelers, he faces increasing pressure from his peers and he ultimately caves and returns to the fold. Babbitt's adventure into liberalism is just that, it's an adventure. His character is so constituted that he feels flooded with relief to be accepted by his friends again following his wife's bout with appendicitis. When his mates at the athletic club josh him about his middle name Follansby, Babbitt feels whole again. With Babbitt restored to his original social position, more or less, Lewis returns to the more familiar settings from the book's beginning, the athletic club and his home in Floral Heights, marking the end of his protagonist's peregrinations through the various worlds or through the cosmos of Zenith. Sinclair Lewis wrote scores of characters based solely on his observations and skills as a mimic. The people who had been the prototypes for such characters could and sometimes did recognize themselves in Lewis's fiction. Other characters Lewis classified simply as types, that is, stereotypical and sometimes caricatured versions of people commonly seen in American culture. The character of George F. Babbitt did not exactly fit either of these categories. Significantly, Lincoln states, there is no prototype listed for Babbitt, and he seems to be a composite, indeed a creation. To understand why Lewis chose this different approach to creating Babbitt, and to understand why he selected the exact blend of characteristics that he chose for this character, it may be useful to consider Lewis's decision in light of the other major narrative task he set for himself, that of portraying a mid-sized American city. Lewis needed a character who could take the reader Virgil-like through the entire cosmos of Zenith that he had created, from center to periphery and back again. The fact that Lewis was able to create a character who satisfied this narrative need and still seemed to live and breathe speaks to the extraordinary magnitude of Sinclair Lewis's literary powers as they reached their height in the early 1920s. And that's it. I had added a kind of a paragraph about the Virgil-like idea, but we had discussed that after a previous presentation. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to present to this group. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Well, thank you again to our presenters. I'm not sure, Sally, if we're. I know the next session starts at 3:30, 2:30.
It starts at 2:30, so we should have like 15-20 minutes for questions or discussion.
Okay. So I guess I'll start. It's not so much a question, just it's a couple other people have said it, the way these not just in the panels themselves, but across the panels, the way that a lot of these talks are talking to one another. And one thing that's interesting, we're talking about sort of transatlanticism, we're talking about international, Lewis in Spain was fascinating to me. But here we have connections going back to classical literature, but also Zenith moving into the future, this dystopian London. So it's just, this kind of maybe speaks to, we always say Lewis is pretty timeless, and I know a big theme was how relevant he is today. So maybe that's what makes, he sort of sees these things that would seem otherwise unconnected, and shows something that's sort of transcendent in there.
I'll add something with
go ahead, Shaun.
Yeah, connected to your paper and seeing into the future, I was going to link this also to the Brave New World question. One thought I had is in new generations, I had hardly heard of boosterism growing up, or the booster debate, but how ubiquitous that idea is. And I was thinking for your paper, the ubiquity of gentrification today would maybe be a way of tying that timelessness. But boosterism was also about establishing the cities first, and now this constant reform or refurbishment. Just wondering your thoughts on that of boosterism and gentrification. I could also do I was going to do the Huxley link in just a little bit.
Okay.
Just one other thing, linked to Aldous Huxley, and I was grateful for the paper, as well as looking forward to the discussion about H.G. Wells, because I'm a science fiction fan as well. Was always curious about these links and interrelations, because how both Huxley and Wells wrote realist novels or social commentary, satire, but also science fiction. Lewis never went in that direction, but I'll add as a Californian, I'll add a third author to this conversation. And that is other main author that I researched is Philip K. Dick. And I found some sources. Philip K. Dick was a big fan of Babbitt as well, and Sinclair Lewis. And if you read some of his works, I think you can, I kind of came to Babbitt partly through that. It was just so interesting, that kind of backwards. I'm hearing Babbitt in this. And so I just wanted, Rich, if you had commentary on that, or just, it's just interesting because I always wonder with that, what would have happened if Lewis wrote a fully science fiction novel, but he was so influenced by that kind of back and forth or technology and things like that. So thanks.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I didn't know about the relationship between Philip K. Dick and Sinclair Lewis. But I think the point that I would make is that there are these larger concerns about standardization, about conformity, about the destruction of knowledge in pursuit of power. And these are things that are just central to Lewis. They're central to Aldous Huxley, but they're not unique to these authors. And so what you can see is these kind of things ping-ponging off each other. I mean, I think it's almost certain that Huxley was influenced to some degree by Lewis's novels. But I also think that you don't need Lewis to explain Huxley because there are so many other inputs to that. So it's not surprising then that these, go out the other side to authors like Philip K. Dick, or like my wife Vicky was noting how similar Brave New World is to a novel I haven't read, though my kids have, the young adult novel, The Giver. So these ideas keep replaying and they keep having kind of significance, although they're reframed in a whole range of different sort of circumstances than the particularities of kind of, the post World War I world, which was the specific context for Lewis and Huxley's concerns.
Well, and beyond Babbitt, the Dodsworth link with being the automobile and R4, it's a great connection too. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'll just, I don't have much to say about gentrification. It seems interesting. We're talking about after George's talk about these all of these various discourses that whatever they mean, they're designed to persuade or dissuade or boost or knock or whatever. But what I did find is that Boosterism has sort of, in the 19th century, you're trying to get, first of all, to draw people there before you can even draw businesses. But the language really didn't change, and they had this whole mythology going back to and this is in all of Lewis's novels, sort of the first families, the pioneers, and things like that. So, and that seems, maybe it's degenerating, but it's still there. So.
And in case, Boosterism is another connection to Brave New World. If you guys read the novel, you remember the novel, every individual is engineered into one of 5 castes, and each caste is conditioned to see their own caste as the best and the other castes as suboptimal compared to their own sort of experience. And so really what Huxley is doing is, this is Boosterism, but it's Boosterism in which everybody is satisfied with their place in the world. And so again, I think you can see that, and Shaun, as you pointed out, this is coming from the 19th century, and Huxley is responding to this, and again, extrapolating it into a thoroughly engineered future.
Yeah, and just in Aerosmith, I was struck by Winnemac is being described as a Ford motor factory of a university. So it's pumping out these perfectly moral, decent, normal folks. Ted, did you have your hand up earlier?
I did. Not to derail the conversation going on, I had another connection across some of these talks that I thought would be interesting to point out.
Yeah, please.
And actually, first, one more sci-fi plug. I was reading The Man Who Sold the Moon by Heinlein, and in the intro, he praises and notes inspiration from Lewis's map making, world building kind of research. So I thought, just again, his reach is everywhere. No, but the point I wanted to make, because I heard it in your talk, Shaun, I heard it earlier today, that this kind of interesting tension between belonging and maybe boosterism on the other end of the scale. You know, I find when I teach Babbitt, we always encounter the question, is Babbitt a villain, right? Who's the villain of this novel? I find him maybe uncomfortably relatable. You know, I think I am Babbitt sometimes when he's in the tub and imagining things. You know, it's revealed. There's such humanity in him, and he wants to belong, right? And when in the sort of student affairs world these days, this word is a catchword now. We want students to feel belonging when they're in college, and that they don't have it. But I would also say that when Babbitt is at his worst, it's when he's motivated by wanting to belong, when he's kind of enslaved by the belonging instinct, because all they can do is follow suit. And when he's boosting, or when he's, you know, he's not really acting from an internal moral guide, he's just trying to fit in. So he's, I don't know, there's something to that. You know, we want belonging. It's human. We need it, and yet there is this kind of danger. And ultimately, when we talk about who is the villain, it's Zenith. That's the bad guy in the novel, because all of the characters are sort of stuck in these squares, and once pushed out of it, they dissolve. You know, they can't live outside of their neatly defined place. And it's because its belonging is both a trap and an invitation. It's a tension I'm hearing across some of these talks that I just wanted to note.
If
I wish I had a
could build
question.
if I could build off of what you were saying, Tad, you know, the idea of Zenith as villain is really interesting, and specifically, I think about the Good Citizens League as this enforcement sort of like organ of the city that like prevents Babbitt specifically in this case from straying at all into his like midlife crisis. I totally hear what you're saying about how it's uncomfortable to sympathize with him sometimes, and I completely get that. But I just wanted to really briefly share something that I found really interesting, because my impression was, is I was originally thinking about another version of a paper where you go from Main Street to Babbitt to It Can't Happen Here, with these increasing levels of like enforcement of conformity, like from you can't be a Carol Kennicott type idealist to like, no, you can't say that or you're going to be thrown in a concentration camp and killed, and It Can't Happen Here. And the Good Citizen League seemed like sort of a stepping stone between those two things. And I was really surprised when I wanted to just share my screen real fast. There was an actual organization. So this was a historical paper. There was a Minneapolis Citizens Alliance. So in the World War I, and they were basically an armed militia. They were on the streets of Minneapolis. So the strike type scenes that are depicted at the end of Babbitt were not very, I mean, they were obviously fictional, but there was factual basis for those things. So, and Rich thinking about like the how in Brave New World, which has been a long time since I read, but there's that authoritarian nature to that society. And so I was just really surprised to learn, looking 100 years back, that had come into existence already. So that, looking at the end of Babbitt, that wasn't something that he was just imagining, like he kind of was with It Can't Happen Here. He was like describing things that he was actually seeing. So that to me is, I mean, I think that Sinclair Lewis is prophetic. it's also frightening to look back and see that what he was describing actually was what was happening, and that kind of like other things like Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, that I didn't hear about till 5 years ago. These are kind of incidents in American history that are not given the spotlight very much, but that were actually real.
Well, I think that's, I think that the violence that's kind of under the surface in a lot of Lewis's novels, it can't happen here as a great example, but, I think to King's Blood Royal, the end of King's Blood Royal, where an armed mob comes to drive them out. And as George knows, a lot of that is based on historical fact, that the covenants and everything of Minnesota, because everybody thinks, oh, it's so racist down south, but not up north. And when you get to King's Blood Royal, it's different, but it's just as bad. And that there were lynchings in Duluth in the early 20th century.
And one thing I think really, trying to think about, I've been thinking about Huxley and Brave New World, exclusively in terms of Lewis's novels of the 1920s, but of course, Lewis keeps writing. And one of the interesting questions that people have been debating for decades is, what was more prophetic? Was it 1984 Orwell, or was it Brave New World? And in a way, what Brave New World is a dystopia of 1920s United States, whereas 1984 is totalitarianism, it's Germany, it's Russia, it's the Ku Klux Klan. And so this is the real, raises this question: if we're reading dystopias, how much of it is going to be a dystopia of the soft dystopia of consumer society, which is Brave New World, and how much of it is going to be the boot to the face, which is 1984. But the interesting thing is we can see how Lewis is himself evolving from the soft dystopia of the 1920s into a much more Orwellian dystopia in 1935 with It Can't Happen Here.
I have a follow-up question to that. Can you hear me? This is George. Okay, Rich. Not only is Babbitt an appealing book because of the fact that we're sort of manipulated into liking the character, but it's also appealing because there's humor in it. He's a comic character, and it doesn't have the book doesn't have a kind of serious, overzealous alarmism about it. You're delighted when Babbitt returns to being Babbitt. Well, my memory of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, is kind of stale now. It's been a long time since I've read it. But my sense of Brave New World was that there was a little bit of humor in that too. In fact, what I didn't like about Brave New World Revisited was that it was a little more serious and more alarmist, more zealous, more like Orwell. I thought that I liked Brave New World because it had that leavening of a little bit of humor. Would you agree with that? That there's a little bit there? And what difference does that make?
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. There are some genuinely funny bits, particularly in the conditioning about how ending is better than mending, and all of these insipid slogans that people are sort of taught to force them into conformity with this consumer society. So yeah, I think there are bits in Brave New World that are funny, although the end of the book is extraordinarily grim. It ends with, of course, John the Savage, his attempt to go into voluntary exile failing and then committing suicide. We also have Bernard Marx, who I think is his character arc in Brave New World is very Babbitt-like. He desires, well, on one hand, he desires to break through the shackles of this stupefying society. On the other hand, he desires also to have its benefits. And what ends up happening in Babbitt is Babbitt could go into exile, but he doesn't. He reconforms, whereas Bernard Marx is kind of essentially drug off kind of unwillingly into exile. So well, yeah. So while there are these funny bits, the novel gets grim, and Huxley during this period was kind of notorious for for his pessimism, not just this novel but other ones. So it's the humor ultimately I think gets washed away by the tragedy of it all, in a way that doesn't happen, as you point out, in Babbitt.
And if he was so pessimistic during this era, why did he inject elements of humor?
Well, because part of it, I think, is, he did have a little bit of the heart of the satirist in him. And I think that what he was trying to do is to heighten his condemnation of Brave New World with, not just pointing out that it's sinister, but it's ridiculous. And that its dehumanization is going to lead us not just to horrible places, but to nonsensical places as well. So, and that's one of the things where I've read Huxley's essays sort of extensively, and they also have a certain kind of, they're not unrelentingly grim. What I'm in the process of doing is reading his other novels, and which I think are more famous for reaching deeply pessimistic places.
I'd like to add, if I may, shortly before Huxley died, and he died the same day that John Kennedy was assassinated, November 22nd, 1963. He was interviewed and said that while he had imagined Brave New World coming into reality thousands of years in the future, he saw indications, and he mentions these in Brave New World Revisited, that it's coming much faster and coming with a vengeance. And so, Rich, it doesn't surprise me, particularly on one point, that Huxley critiqued Wells' faith in technology and saw what was happening, the persuasive power of technology, electronic technology, which we'll pick up in the next session.
Yeah, absolutely. And also in that radio play from 1956, in his narration, a bit that I don't play, is he said that, I set this 600 years in the future, but it's looking more like 200 years in the future. So that's something that, it wasn't a late life thing. He was consistent about these concerns.
Well, that sounds like a good transition, since we have 5 minutes till our next session. So thank you all. Thank you, Shaun, for chairing, and thank you, Rich, and thank you, Greg. And I'll have Edsel stop the recording and have everybody move to the last session, and we'll see you in a minute.